Hey all, so here we are again. Um, we're winding down to the end of the semester, so you should be thinking about what you want to write about. And again, I would look at whatever the syllabus said since the third paper was submitted to the end, anything from there to the end. Some of the drama, Oedipus, the two that I'm going to do today, and a couple of the poems. I think they're war poems, other ones as well. So on the syllabus, it's everything from week 13 straight to the end. You can pick something to write about. A reminder, of course, it's the same as always. Pick something, if you want, a character or a poem or a short story or a play that you think you can get a piece of and talk about it and sort of explicate that to your reader. We want to understand that you understand this and you're making us understand something about it. Remember, you're not just trying to prove to the reader that you read it. It's more than that. We want to get an idea from this. And of course, we'll do the introductions and we'll do that and the introductions and the ideas for the essay and the introductions in the week to come. So, if you haven't read them yet, there's only 3 pieces of drama that I'm asking you to look at. Oedipus is one, and of course the discussion board still has the question up about Oedipus. The other 2 are much shorter. One of them is called Trifles, and I guess I'll talk about that first. First of all, you should know, and it's not in the textbook, but there is a short story called A Jury of My Peers or A Jury of Her Peers. A Jury of Her Peers. Jury like judge and jury. A Jury of Her Peers by the same woman, Susan Glaspell, which is a small story that was the original piece, I think, and then she turned it into a play, which is the one that I'm asking you to read. But if you can find it and get a hold of the short story, you'll sort of know what it's about. The play is better because it gives you this dialogue between the people, and it's important to look at that. Basically, it's a short play about the townspeople, some men who find the body of Mr. Right, who turns out to be Mr. Wrong, dead in his bed, been strangled by this rope, a string, and the wife is there, but the wife is virtually, catatonic. She's not saying anything. She just sits there and she says, "I was sleeping and he's dead," and that's the end of it. Throughout the play, you get 2 things are happening. Okay, one is it's not really a whodunit. We know, or we find out, that the wife did it. But it's not a mystery about that. The question really is, why did she do it? And more importantly, how do we respond to the 2 women in the play who are the wives of the lawyer and the cop? How they figure it out, and what do we think about what they did? So the play opens up in the kitchen. This is the early part of the 20th century. Men do their own work, do the man work. Women do the girl work. So the women just sort of sit there in the kitchen appropriately, right? The old-fashioned view of a woman being in the kitchen. And they go looking for clues. They are convinced that she's done it, but they can't figure out a motive. They're looking. He was strangled. She's in the house. She's the only one there. But they don't believe that she would have the ability to do it, and they can't figure out why. Usually you need what? Means, motive, and opportunity to commit a crime, right? That's what they look for. And so they can't figure out why she would do this. What's wrong? She has a perfectly good life. As you read the story, the play, you realize that Mrs. Mrs. Wright. She used to be known as, Minnie something or other. I forget her name. Minnie. I want to say Minnie Driver, but I know that's not right. Minnie something. Her name is Minnie. And she married this guy. God knows why. And he immediately took her out of the small town they were in and moved to an even more remote place in the woods. She used to be very popular. She was a dancer. She was a singer. She was a wonderful, expressive, extroverted woman. He just wanted her to stay home and do nothing, have no visitors. At one point, she buys a canary. And he kills the canary, and she keeps it in a box. The women, Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale, are sitting there and they are discussing this. They find some of the things that she has not finished doing, like making her preserves, and the kitchen seems to be a little bit of a mess. The men criticize this. So there's a distinction between men and women in this, by the way. The men all look like idiots. They can't figure things out. They're just running around looking for clues. The women figure it out. The women find the sewing equipment. She was very good at sewing and crocheting and knitting. And they realize that the knot around the husband's neck is the same knot that she used in her crocheting. So they put it together. They also find the body of the bird that she saved. The only thing that gave her any pleasure. And so she killed her husband. Now, what happens in the play is that at some point the men come back into the room and they ask some questions, and the two women, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, they lie about what they found. They say there must have been a cat somewhere, and they don't actually discuss it at first. They just both agree, sort of by themselves, individually, to lie about what they found. They figure out the motive. Ultimately, they feel that her life was taken by him, so she took his life. Now, this idea of justifiable homicide has come up in current times. There was a woman, I think it's back in the 70s, whose husband was abusive. He used to come home drunk and beat her. It was terrible. And after years and years of this, one day he came home drunk, he beat her, and he was laying in the bed, and she threw gasoline all over him, and she burned him up. The name of the movie, by the way, it's called The Burning Bed. And she does not go to jail because the law called that self-defense. She was sure that, and it seemed the government, the judge also felt that she was in fear for her life. The same thing is for Mr. Bobbitt. You may have read about Lorena Bobbitt. Without going into graphic detail, he was the same way. He was abusive, he was a drunk, and he was violent. And one day, she cut off his, just cut it right off and threw it into the driveway. They found it, by the way, when the cops were called, and they put it back on. They sewed it back on. And she did not go to jail because she proved to the courts that she was in fear of her life. So this notion of women reacting to the violence of their husbands is already a precedent. It's not a new thing, unfortunately, but it's something that we have to ask ourselves when we read this play. There are some of you who feel that Mrs. Hale and Mrs. What's the hell's her name? Peters should have told what they know to the police. The police should know all the facts. Don't keep anything. And they also tampered with evidence. Some of you may feel, no, it's okay. This is a moral issue, justifiable. She had a right to take that man's life. He was a horrible man. This is up to you to decide. The other thing to remember about this play, and another interesting part of this is besides the moral issue of it being a play like this, is the timeliness of it. It was a play written back in the late 19th century, some early 20th century. I don't have the exact dates here. 19 something, 18 I think. And we have a really very special bond between the two women. Through their discussions of things and how they get to know each other, they realize that they're both women and they're both stuck in this situation. We live so close together and we live far apart. We go through the same things. It's just a little different kind of the same thing. What Mrs. Hale says to Mrs. Peter. At the end of the story, they're talking to each other, and they empathize with Minnie, who kills her husband, and we're left with: is this okay that they did not tell the police? That this kind of justifiable homicide is something we can live with when we're in on it. Of course, the short story I mentioned, a jury of her peers, refers to, well, if she had 12 people on a jury that were women like her in her day, not abused like her, but just women, that they would not convict her. That's the idea, you know. So it's about women, it's about the dominance of dopey men, it's about bonding, it's about women's liberation, and it's about the moral idea of justifiable homicide. So you have to ask yourself those questions. The other play, almost 100 years later, a little bit less, called Poof. Very short play. Matter of fact, I would recommend, if you get a chance, and this is what we would have done in class. We would have read these out loud in class. So if you don't want to bother with long pieces from Oedipus or even this one called Trifles, do yourself a favor, find a friend, you and a friend, just takes two people, two of you. One of you become Lorena and one of you become Florence and Lorraine. I'm sorry, Florence and Lorraine, and read the play out loud. This is sort of a modern version of Trifles. It takes place in a tenement somewhere in the city. It's two African American women. He comes in and he screams at her. He has one line, the husband, and what does she say? She screams back. She says, "Damn you to hell, Samuel." And as the title of the play, poof, he vanishes. He spontaneously combusts. He becomes a pile of dust on the floor. And she calls her friend from upstairs to come down, and she tells her what happened. And first the girl doesn't believe her, and then she does. And he was a miserable guy like Mr. Wright was in Trifles. And the two women are friends, and their friendship is a strange thing. I mean, the woman upstairs understands that she's better off without him, but then she's envious of her. And she thinks, can you do that for me? Why can't you say, "God damn you to hell" to my husband? He disappears. And, but they're friends. And the other one's got to get back up to her husband. She's going to continue with her life with this miserable guy. And the other woman sits down to have dinner, and she sweeps him under the rug and continues with her life. There's no way anybody can ever catch her. She didn't actually do anything. And so we have another version of this same kind of story that we saw in Trifles. Much easier to read, much more fun to read in some ways. And I wish we could have had some time to do it ourselves in front of each other. What you also can think about, if any of you want to take a more esoteric idea here, is that in Poof, It's also a play about the power of language, how strong language can be, which has nothing to do with men and women, husband and wife, and abuse. I mean, she says, "Damn you to hell," and her language makes him vanish. And you just think about the idea of how strong language is, what we say, the old expression that the pen is mightier than the sword, that what you say and how you say it, which is rhetoric, which is what we teach in college, right? The way you say things. And in this literature class, the way people write things, the words they use to get their points across, whether it's a poem or it's a short story or it's a play or it's a novel, words are being used to convey ideas. Anyway, that's sort of a tangent to think about, something else to think about in terms of language. There's a lot of stories that deal with language and how strong it is and how it fails us sometimes, or it helps us sometimes. Even back in reading about The Story of an Hour, I mean, when she starts to feel and think about her husband's death, she just has to say the words freedom, free, free, free. It all comes down to the words, you know. So there's two things there. I'd like to. So that'll be it for a drama. Okay, you got 3 pieces of drama to think about: Oedipus, Trifles, and Poof. Certainly, the last 2 you can compare if you wanted to compare characters or the whole idea of them. You can take them individually. You can talk about the use of men in the first one, Trifles. Certainly they are, especially the detective or the inspector, whatever he is, he's an idiot. He never wants to talk about it now. I'll talk about it later. We'll get to it later, he says. Anyway, read them again. It's worth your time. I mean, look, there's probably not another time in your life where anyone's going to ask you to read a play. So at least you got 3 pretty good ones if you read these. They're worth your time, so try it. We'll get to what's next on his hit parade. The next bunch of reading will be 2 short poems, one by Robert Herrick, which we already read one of his. We read To the Virgins to Make Much of Time. That was him. We'll read this one, and we'll do 1 Shakespeare poem. Okay, so read that. After that, there are 3 poems that I call the war poems. One is called The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner. One is called, in Latin, Dulce et Decorum Est. And the other one is called The Man He Killed. All of them have to do with war. And you should take a look at those. Keep in mind that short story that we read a while ago called Soldier's Home. When you read these, we certainly could bring that into the discussion as well. So there's at least those 2 videos coming. And there's a short story after that to look at by Kurt Vonnegut called Happy Birthday 1951. So there's a couple of things to look at, all of which are possibilities for your final essay. That's it. Take care of yourself. Be well. And I hope to see everybody soon. Okay? Peace.